Hey everybody, Rob here at etrailer.com, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Roadmaster Rear Anti-Sway Bar on our 2016 Winnebago Sightseer Motorhome. Our sway bars are going to eliminate or at least reduce the amount of body roll that we get and that really soft feeling when we're driving down the road, so we can feel a lot more in control and relax a little bit and actually enjoy our motorhome the way it's supposed to be. For the back here, typically most motorhomes are going to have your bathroom, maybe a bedroom. There's still quite a bit of weight back here, especially if you're flat towing a vehicle behind your motorhome. That's a lot of weight, even more weight on the back, and it ends up kind of pushing and pulling the back end of the motorhome around. And again, we get that rolling, mushing, kind of soft feeling where we really don't feel like we're in control. And that weight transfer does even go all the way up to the front, so we end up getting this big body roll going down the road. And again, it's kind of an unnerving feeling, especially if you're not used to driving something this big. So being able to stiffen up the suspension and reduce that amount of body roll definitely makes you feel like you're in more control. The motorhome's going to be more responsive and that much easier to drive. So here's what our rear sway bar is going to look like once we have it installed. And if you look forward, you'll see that we actually still have our factory sway bar installed as well, and that's because our rear sway bar is not going to replace our factory sway bar, but it's going to be an addition and add that much more support at the back here. Now the way it's going to provide us that support and reduce the body roll and sway feeling that we get is our sway bar is going to attach to the axle as well as the frame using these end links here. That way whenever we get in a turn, it's going to use the weight of the axle to brace against the frame. That way it's going to prevent it from twisting and turning so much, because it's going to constantly be trying to keep it nice and level, pulling on the other side. Now the bar itself is going to be made out of a 4140 chrome moly steel. So it's going to be extremely hard, extremely stiff and durable. And it's going to be 1 5/8 inches thick, so it's a pretty thick bar, and it's definitely going to reduce the amount of swaying we feel, because it's not going to want to flex, and it's going to stay nice and rigid and brace itself against those turns whenever we do go to turn. But there is a little bit of flex that's needed, and that's where the bushings come in. We're going to have polyurethane bushings, so they are going to hold up a little bit better than rubber. They're going to be a little bit stiffer than rubber and last longer. They're not going to be susceptible to oil, gasoline, or any other automotive chemicals breaking them down, and we're not going to have to worry about them wearing out. So as we go through our test course, we're going over our speed bumps. Now the speed bumps aren't going to show us that much because this is a sway bar, so it's more of the side-to-side movement than it is the up and down. But what's nice about the sway bars with those speed bumps is since they're alternating and we get kind of that side-to-side effect, it's definitely diminishing it after we get over. So we may have that initial lean, but as soon as we get over the bump, it levels out and we're back on the road. And today is actually a really good day to test out our sway bars because it's really rainy and it's really windy, so we can get a good feel of how we're going to be pushed around or not pushed around on the road. And as I come up to the slalom course, I'm going to be going about 10 miles an hour just so I can get a nice baseline. But even just going through the parking lot, I can already feel a difference. It's not so much that it feels like a sports car, because don't get me wrong, this is still a really big vehicle, but it definitely feels a lot easier to handle. I don't get so much of that mushy feeling as I'm going in and out of the turns. I'm just driving. When I turn, the motorhome wants to turn, and then as I come out of the turn, it just straightens back out. We don't get that leaning real hard and then turn. Now as far as the installation goes, it is going to come with all the necessary components to get it installed. Now it's not very complicated, but I will let you know that the torque values for some of the bolts are extremely high and they're very tight to begin with. So that's probably going to be the hardest part, is we're going to have to loosen the U-bolts on the rear axle so we can mount this plate. Other than that, it's really just a matter of sliding some bolts through and mounting the hardware up. But now that we've seen what our bar looks like and we've taken it on our test course and gone over some of the features, let's go and go through the installation process together, and we'll show you how to even get it in without a lift. To begin our installation, we want to park our motorhome on a nice flat level surface. Now we don't need a lift to lift it up, but we can use the leveling jacks to lift up our motorhome just enough to where we get a little bit of stretch in the suspension. You can see that all the tires are still on the ground, But again, we stretched out the suspension so we have a little bit more room to work underneath. And also, if we come to the side, it's going to be the first step of removing a couple bolts. Now if we look in the wheel well towards the back right here, we can see our frame right here. But if we look against the frame, we're going to see 4 bolts. These 2 lower bolts need to come out. And since we lifted it up, it allows the bolts to be right on top of the leaf spring, because if the suspension was all the way down, they would actually be behind the leaf spring here. So if you lift it up, it'll give you just enough room so you can get a long extension and get a socket onto the bolts. You're going to want to use a 21mm socket and pull the 2 bolts out. So remove those bolts. We can go underneath and grab the keeper nuts and pull the bolts out. Now these are going to be our frame brackets. Now you can see they're kind of an L shape and then have 2 tabs coming down. We want the flat section with the 2 holes to go against the outside of the frame, where we just remove those bolts. This will go right up to the bottom and the tabs will come down through, going towards the bottom of the frame. So I'm going to go ahead and crawl in here, slide my bracket in place, and then put the hardware through, at least just to hold itself up. Then on the inside of the frame, these are what those keeper nuts are. Is that tab, as the nut starts to spin, it's going to catch the end of the frame and keep it from spinning, so it's almost like a built-in wrench on there. So we just want to get these loosely started on the inside of the frame, and then we can tighten our bolts back up and repeat that same process on the other side. So now if we move underneath our motorhome, we're going to find our rear axle, and we want to come to the very bottom of the axle. Now underneath we're going to have this large plate with 4 nuts holding the U-bolts in place. We need to loosen up these nuts so that we can get a bracket in. So I went ahead and sprayed these down with some penetrating oil, and I definitely suggest doing that. Maybe give it some time to soak in, because these bolts are extremely tight, and again we need to take them off. So we're going to be using a 1 1/8 inch socket, and we're going to remove all 4 nuts. Just keep in mind this plate is pretty heavy, so I like to leave at least one on hand tight so I don't have to worry about that plate falling down. And if you can't break it loose using a gun, you may have to use a long breaker bar to at least break them loose, and then we can take them off the rest of the way using an impact. So go ahead and leave that one on there just real loose. We'll work on getting the rest of them loose on this side. Then I want to grab the axle bracket. We're going to have 2 slotted holes and then 2 large round holes in this kind of squared section. Then we're going to have a little tab that kind of tapers off, and then be 4 small holes in there. The 4 larger and slotted holes are going to line up with our factory U-bolts. We're just going to slide it right below this plate. That's why we left that 1 nut in place, and then we're going to reattach the factory hardware. You just want to make sure you put the washer and nut back in. Now the small holes are going to be going towards the center and pointing towards the back, so you should have those 2 slotted holes grab the front of the bracket like this. So we're going to remove the last nut that's holding that plate in. Now I kind of like to, if you can, kind of wedge the plate up high enough to where you got your bolts sticking out below. And kind of use one hand to kind of wedge it in place. Remove that last U-bolt. And both of these plates are a little heavy. The one that's on the motorhome is a little heavy, and then the bracket here is also a little heavy. So if we can get both of them just kind of sandwiched like that and get at least 1 washer and nut started, it'll keep the bracket from completely falling off, and we can work on getting the rest of the hardware in. Now I do suggest doing these one at a time. So we broke all these loose, removed it, we're going to put the plate in, make sure we tighten it down, and then we're going to move to the other side and remove the other nuts and put the plate in. Let's get these loosely back in place, and we can start tightening everything up. Now whenever we tighten up the U-bolts, we want to alternate. Not just from each leg on the U-bolt, but we want to go front to back and side to side, alternating them. So when it tightens up, it evenly clamps that U-bolt down, and we don't get it at a weird crooked angle. Now you do want to make sure you come back with a torque wrench and torque all the U-bolts down to the specified amount in the instructions. Okay. Once you have this bracket torqued down, all 4 U-bolts and nuts are back in place. We're going to move over to the other side and repeat that entire process. So at this point, we want to grab our shackle brackets. On one end, we'll have a bushing with an eyelet through it. The other end is kind of a fork, just 2 tabs coming down. We want to slide the bushing in between the frame bracket that we installed initially. And we want to take a long bolt, and coming from the outside, we're going to go through the bracket, through the bushing, into the inside of the frame. Just slide it in position. I'll take our bolt, make sure it's lined up, and then just let it hang. We want to take a nylon lock nut, and for now we can just loosely install it so we know that the shackle bracket's not going to come off, it's not going to fall. We'll move to the other side and put the other one in place the exact same way. At this point, we can grab our sway bar, we're going to slide it underneath our motorhome, and now on the ends here where we have our bushings, these are going to fit right into those shackle mounts. We're going to use the same large 1/2-inch bolt. And the lock nut. And since it's rather large and kind of heavy, what we can do is we can get one side in place first. Just kind of lift it up, get one bolt in place, and then once you get the bolt through, again, we're just going to loosely attach that nylon lock nut on one side, and we'll move to the other side, put the bolt and nut in place. So now before we actually get our bar in place and mount it up to the bracket itself, we want to get some hardware in place. It's a little bit easier to handle. So we're going to take one of these shorter bolts out of our kit and a flat washer. If we come up to the bracket, we want to go through the farthest rear hole. Then we'll grab another bolt and flat washer. We're going to skip one hole and then go through the other one. It's going to be the 2 that are the furthest back that are in line with each other. And we're going to repeat that for the other side as well. Now in your kit, they are going to give you new bushings as well. They're split bushings, so they're really easy to open up, slide onto the bar. But before we do, we want to grab the lubricant out of our kit. And I definitely recommend wearing gloves because it gets pretty messy pretty quick. We want to take that lubricant and coat the entire inside of that bushing. And that's just going to help with any kind of noise when we're driving down the road. In case any kind of water or moisture gets inside the bushing, it's going to keep it from squeaking and making a bunch of noise. So just coat the inside really well. Can open up the bushing. And pretty close to the end here is about where we want to put it. And once we have that in place, we can grab the actual bracket. There's a little channel. It's going to slide right over the bushing and just sit there in place like that. Now we got another bushing and another bracket that we're going to put on the other side of the bar, and then we can lift everything up. Now at this point, you can notice that we have plenty of slack and movement in our bar itself. Well, we need to rotate the bar up so that our brackets here line up with our bolts. And then once we have the bolts coming through the bracket, we want to follow it up with a flat washer and then a hex nut on each one of the bolts coming down through. So it's best if you can just get your bar loosely lifted up, at least get one side started, and then we can move to the other side. Then we can move to the other side and make any kind of adjustments we need to, sliding the bar around. But you just want to get at least one on each side. That way the sway bar will hold itself up and we can put the rest of the hardware in place. And we want to go back and tighten up all of our hardware. Now for our bushing mounts, we're going to use an 18mm socket for the nut and a 17mm socket wrench for the bolt. The bolt has slightly smaller head than the nut does, so you'll need a combination of a 17 and an 18mm socket and wrench. Now for our larger bolts that are holding the ends of the bushings and the shackle mounts in place, we want to tighten these up, and we can use a combination of either a 15/16 or a 24mm for both the bolt and the bolt and the nut. But as we tighten them up, You can see that bushing inside of there. We only want to tighten these up to where it just touches the bushing. We don't want to really clamp down on it and crush the bushing. Again, we just want to tighten it up to where there's just enough pressure to where it touches that bushing and doesn't crush it. And then we're going to tighten the one up top with the bushing as well, the same way. Just tighten enough to where it just touches those bushings. Once you have all your bolts tightened down, you can lower your motorhome back down all the way to the ground. Take it for a quick test drive, make sure everything's nice and squared up and it's not pulling left or right or making any weird noises. Now, I do want to mention that we installed the front and the rear anti-sway bar. Now, I suggest doing that anyway because that is going to give you the most stability out of your motorhome and give you the best ride quality. But again, I'm Rob here at etrailer.com, and that'll finish up your look at the Roadmaster Anti-Sway Bar on our 2016 Winnebago Sightseer Motorhome.